Hey everyone! Sustai! My name is Haley and I am currently in Bac Chang, Cambodia at one of CCC's global mission partners, Place of Rescue. Place of Rescue is an orphanage, AIDS hospice center, and home for widowed elderly women spanning at 3 locations throughout Cambodia. Place of Rescue serves over 500 Cambodian people. I am currently at Place of Rescue Center 1, where I am teaching English from April 3rd to May 3rd of this year. This is my 3rd visit to Place of Rescue. I've been at Place of Rescue in 2019 for 2 months and 2020 for 1 month. And I had to abruptly leave in 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. I am so thankful and blessed that God has given me the opportunity to once again return to rescue and teach. Your giving helps support Place of Rescue in countless ways, from paying rent to helping buy food, to most importantly, helping the people in Cambodia share the gospel and good news of Jesus to those who have yet to hear about him. Because you give, Place of Rescue is able to help these children and families and be the hands and feet of Jesus here in Cambodia. Thank you for faithfully giving. Shumrip Lia.
So Leo Tolstoy tells a story of a young peasant farmer named Pakhom, who was happy in every way except he only rented and did not own land. If he only owned land, then everything would be well. So it became known that a landowner nearby was preparing to sell her property, and so Pakhom and some of the other tenant farmers convinced her to subdivide the property and to allow them to purchase property. And so she agreed to take half of the purchase price up front and the rest of the purchase price to be due in 2 years. So Pakhom sold his calf and he sold some bees and he borrowed some money from his brother-in-law and he scraped together the down payment and he paid and he got his land and he tilled the ground and he sowed the crops. And that first year was such a bumper crop that he was actually able to pay his brother-in-law back and pay back the mortgage. And at the end of just the 1 year, he owned his own land and all was well for a while. His neighbors, they were too close. And their livestock kept getting out of their fences and into his place, and they were trampling his corn and they were eating his grain. They were trespassing against him. He needed more room. And so he heard about this place downriver where the land was more plentiful and it was productive, but it was less expensive. And so he sold all that he had and he purchased a homestead in this new place, and it was great. It was a great place to live, to raise livestock, to raise crops, and his wealth increased. And as his wealth increased, he began to plant more and he needed more space, and so he leased land around the county, and it was such a hassle to be able to have to travel from home to go keep up with the land that he leased, and he lost the lease and he lost that full investment. And if only he owned as much land as he was using now, and if only it were close to home, then all would be well. So one day a merchant came by Pakhom's place and he brought him in and allowed the horses to rest, and over tea, this merchant told Pakhom about this place where there was plenty of land for sale. A man could own all the property that he could use, and it sounded exactly like Pakhom was looking for. And so he packed his bags and he headed off to this new place. It was a long journey. When he arrived in the village, he inquired about land for sale. He was accustomed to buying land by the acre. But this new place sold land in a different way. They sold land by the day. And so what would happen is you would pay the purchase price, and then the next morning you would start out on your journey and you could own as much land as you could walk in a day. The only catch was if you didn't make it back to your starting point by the end of the day, you forfeited the entire purchase price and received no land. And so Pakhom thought that sounded great. He paid the purchase price. He began the next morning at sunrise with a good pace, taking advantage of the early morning, the cool of the early morning hours. And he was off on his journey purchasing land by the day, and men on horseback stayed with him to mark his progress. So mid-morning rolls around and he's on his course and he sees a field that would be great for growing flax. And so he bends his course to take in that field, and the sun continues to rise and it's starting to get warmer and warmer. And so he takes off his jacket and continues, and as he's on his journey, he realizes he needs to start to bend back around to the left because he's got to get back to the starting place by the time the sun sets. And so he bends. But as he bends, he sees another field that would be amazing for the grain that he needs for his livestock. And so he bends to take that in too. And the sun is rising higher and higher, and it's getting hotter and hotter. And he begins to realize that it is well past midday, and it's going to be very difficult for him to get back to the starting point by the time the sun sinks below sky. And so he begins to hurry, and he strips off not just his overjacket, but now he's taking off his coat and his shirt as he begins to move because it's hot, and he's far away, and the sun was just starting to touch the horizon as his finish line came into view. And he still had so far to go. And so he stripped off his boots. They were slowing him down, and he began to run. And he ran and he ran and he ran. And just as the sun sank below, he fell, collapsed on his face, and he made it. Like, he crossed the finish line. He had purchased his land. He lay in the dirt, panting, soaked in sweat, bleeding from the mouth, bleeding from his feet. He crawled to his hands and his knees, and then he collapsed. He died. The title, and they buried him in a grave that was about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. The title of this story is How Much Land Does a Man Really Need? So we're in this series. It's called Plot Twist. And we're looking at stories, and talking about stories that Jesus is telling us. And each of these stories he tells us has a plot twist to it. And there's a plot twist in the story, but really there's a plot twist in our lives, because when the story of Jesus impacts the story of our life, we get to experience life for the better. And so today we're going to talk about a story that Jesus told that is a straightforward story. It is a powerful story. It is a story that warns us, and it is a story that helps us get victory over greed in our lives. And so I'm really excited for you, for me, that we're here together today, because I think what we're going to talk about is going to be incredibly helpful. It's going to be incredibly beneficial for each one of us. So this story is recorded for us. It's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12. It's been named the parable of the rich fool. And the day that Jesus told it, it was a regular day for him. He was out and about, and people were flocking to him. And actually, Luke records for us that there were thousands of people who had come to see Jesus, to be close to him, to see what's going to happen next. And as these thousands of people are milling around Jesus, this happens. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So this seems like a normal thing to be upset over, especially if you're the younger brother. Like, in Jesus' day, it was really normal for the oldest brother to receive as the inheritance the true wealth of the family. The younger siblings, they might receive something, but the true wealth was passed from the parents, the father particularly, to the older brother. And so here is a younger brother looking at Jesus and saying, "Hey, I want you to get involved, Jesus, and I want you to tell my older brother to split the inheritance with me." And Jesus replies, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you two?" And so he's not going to get involved, but he does issue a warning. He said to him, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." So, like, two things that just jump out at me here real quick for us. The first thing is notice who Jesus identifies as greedy. Right? Because, like, we're sitting here listening to this story, and for sure the older brother, right? He's got all the wealth. and he's holding on to it. And we, with our cultural eyes, look at that and say, yeah, he's the greedy one, but Jesus is talking to both of them. And so not only is he looking at the older brother, he's also looking at the younger brother, and that may seem foreign to us who just seems to want what's fair. And Jesus looks at both of them and says, hey, you be on guard against all kinds of greed. Jesus considers both of them to have an issue here. The second thing that I think is worth noticing in this is Jesus says there's all kinds of greed. Right? There's not just one kind of greed, there's many kinds of greed. And I think we need to consider that for a moment because what you think about when you think about greed is probably not the kind of greed that you have a problem with. It's probably the kind of greed that somebody else whose life impacts yours, that they have a problem with, but it's probably not the kind of greed that you have a problem with. And so we have to know there are all kinds of greed. And so people like us need to pay attention that greed's sneaky. Greed is sneaky. It can sneak into your life and it can be there and you're not even aware of it. So we get to be on our guard against all kinds of greed. Greed is not just the thing that you're thinking about right now. Greed is about more. It's about wanting more. It's about wanting more. And so let me give you this definition of greed as we're talking about it. Greed is a simmering desire for more, for me and mine. Right? Greed is very rarely like on the front burner of your life with the full flame underneath it and the pot boiling over. Like greed it simmers. It's on the back burner. It's on low, but it's there. It's just this simmering desire for more, for me and for mine. And just a short little list here of things that you and I may be greedy for. Money, for sure, ends up at the top of that list. Money, the things that money can buy, experiences that we might have, knowledge that we want, power, that we want more power for our attention. Pay attention to me, impact, influence, pleasure. We have this simmering desire, be on guard against all kinds of greed because we all have this simmering desire for more in our lives. And if we are not on guard against greed, it causes all kinds of problems for us. So just from this story, the preamble to the story, like why Jesus tells it, and then to the story that we're going to work our way through from here, there are really three things that greed eats, that greed destroys in our lives. First one is relationships. Greed will destroy your relationships. Just two brothers in a crowd of thousands of people they're having a public argument over, Jesus, tell my brother to split the inheritance with me. I'm not splitting the inheritance with him. I mean, just this really happened. And can you imagine how much work, relational work, is going to have to be done for those two brothers to get past that? Real life, like most relationships, won't survive this public Jesus step in and tell him what to do. No, I'm not going to do it. Like most relationships, greed destroys our relationships. It destroys our perspective. And we'll see this in a few minutes, but it destroys how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves in relationship with the people who are around us, how we see ourselves in our community in which we live, how we see ourselves in relationship with God. I mean, greed it destroys our perspective. And then this last one, greed destroys our legacy. Our legacy, we all want to leave something behind us that matters, that counts, that when you die, you want somebody to say, their life impacted mine, and greed actually destroys our legacy. And so Jesus gives us this warning to be on your guard against all kinds of greed, because if you're not on guard against all kinds of greed in your life, then what you're going to experience is a loss of relationship, a bad perspective about yourself and relationship with God and others, and a loss of legacy, And so Jesus, after giving this warning, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, then he tells them this parable. So here's the story he tells. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So notice that this guy's already rich. He's already rich. So my friend Will Davis, in talking about people and money and things, he sees three different categories of people, and he talks about people who have more than enough, people who have enough, and people who don't have enough. I think it's a really helpful way to think about it. And this rich guy, he already has more than enough. So this ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. This is a prudent question, right? I mean, like he's had an abundant harvest. He has no place to, what am I gonna do? I've had this windfall in my life. I have this stuff. What am I gonna do to take care of it, to hold on to it? And in a Jewish context, this man would have, because of his wealth and also the success that he was having, he would have been considered blessed by God. He would have, the people who were around him, because he was wealthy, the people who were around him would have looked at him and said, oh, you, my friend, are blessed by God. And actually, because that was the prevailing theology of their day, he would have looked at himself and said, I am wealthy, therefore I am blessed by God. And everything in the text like points to that. There's no hint of him being a cheat or a liar or an oppressor. He's a farmer. He's a hardworking farmer, and he has this bumper crop. It's this blessing that comes to him from God. And farming is the ultimate example of God's blessing on us. Those of you who have an agricultural background and came from that in your family, you know there's so many things for farming. There's so many things that you can't control. You can control just a little bit, and then the rest of it is beyond your control. And what happens with that crop, like you're living under the hand of God in that. At a previous church that Marie and I were part of, I'm one of the people who led worship at our church. He grew up on a farm, and whenever it was raining, the first thing when he would pray is, thank you, God, for rain. Because we can't control. There's so many things that we can't control, and farming is a perfect example for us of how we can't control what's going on. And so this bumper crop that this farmer experiences is truly a blessing from God. This farmer who is living in this story Jesus tells he's living under the blessing of God, so much blessing that he's got to figure out what to do with it. So he says, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, be merry. Seems like a reasonable solution, doesn't it? Get a windfall, you open a couple more investment accounts. I was reading an article about a guy who was still working, but he had finished like through his personal saving, and then from an inheritance he received, his retirement was fully funded. And one of the comments that he made is like, it's really good to know that I'm 2 bad days at work from being able to trade my office for the golf course. And in the culture in which you and I live, like that seems incredibly reasonable that I have an abundance, it's stored up, and that whole eat, drink, and be merry thing, that's not very far away. And when we think about ourselves and we think about the culture we live in, if you think about you and what you would do if this kind of story was your life, I don't think any of us are that far away from this farmer who's experienced this abundant harvest. I'll tear down these smaller barns and I'll build bigger ones so that I've got enough for me and for mine for the foreseeable future. So there's something in this story that I didn't notice until I'd read it through several times. 6 different times the farmer uses the word I. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down. And 4 different times he uses the word my or mine. I'm going to tear down my barns and I'm going to be bigger one. And this is what I'll do, mine. And in this I and mine, there's in this story, there's no consideration of God. There's no consideration of other people. And this is why I said that greed It destroys our perspective. It destroys our perspective. So again, in Jesus' day, and he's telling this story in this community, this wealthy farmer has had this bumper crop, and he's putting all the grain in his own barns. And in the community in which he lived, they needed him to release some of that grain into the market so they could buy it, so that they could have food. And he's not considering at all the impact his decisions have on the people who are around him. And he's received this abundant blessing from God, and he's not thinking at all about what God would have him do with this blessing that he has heaped into his life. All he's thinking about is himself and how he's gonna hang on to this huge crop that he's given. And as a guy who's had more than enough, like, he's got this great opportunity to move towards God and to move to other people who maybe have just enough or not enough, and he's missing this opportunity. And so you and I, what started as a reasonable conversation with himself, I've got all this, I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. I know what I'm gonna do with it. I'm gonna open some more investment accounts, and I'm gonna be 2 bad days at work away from trading my office for the golf course. On further reflection, maybe that's not the whole conversation that he should have been having with himself. And Jesus lets us know that we're starting to see this correctly. So in the story, I know what I'll do. I'll tear them down and I'll build bigger barns. And then God steps in. So God speaks to him. God said to him, "You fool." Strong words, like, "You fool. This very night, your life will be demanded from you." And that word demand is, it's a really interesting word. This very night, your life is gonna be demanded from you. That word demand is from the financial arena, and we've experienced it. If you've ever signed a promissory note, if you've bought a car, or if you've taken out a mortgage on a house, if you've signed a school loan, if you've ever signed a note, you've said, "Hey, I'm borrowing this much money, and I promise I'll pay it back this much per month over this many years." In that note that you sign, there's a provision in there that identifies certain things you would do, that if you do those things, the person you owe money to has a right to demand that you pay it all, and you pay it right now. And God steps in to this guy's planning process and says to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" Because you can't take it with you, right? We know that. You can't take it with you, so who's gonna get it? Who's gonna get it? Okay, so this is what I wonder in this. And I'm just wondering this. So Jesus is telling this story, and it's just a story. But I wonder how close the facts of this story that Jesus is telling are to what happened with the dad of the 2 boys who are arguing over the inheritance. Because if the facts of Jesus' story are close to the facts of the real life scenario of the 2 boys who are arguing over the inheritance, God asks the question, who's gonna get what you have prepared for yourself? The answer to that question is, your greedy kids are gonna get it, and it's gonna tear them apart. And then Jesus makes this statement, having told this story. He says this. He's talking about a few things. Number 1, the negative accountability before God. So this negative accountability before God, this soured relationships, this messed up perspective on life, this marred legacy, this is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich towards God. This is how it'll be. And we got to dial in on the fact. Jesus has no problem that the guy's rich. But he has no problem that the guy was rich. He has no problem that a rich man got richer. He has no problem with him having more than enough. Where Jesus has the problem is that he was rich towards himself, but he was not rich towards God. And so the problem is not just having money, it's what you do with it. And being rich towards God is what gives us the victory over greed in our lives. If you are not rich towards God, you're not gonna have victory over greed in your life. You're going to experience all those things that greed tarnishes and steals from us. And so if you would like to experience victory over greed in your life, if you would like to take back some of the ground that greed has already stolen from you, if you would like to ensure you live with a good perspective in your relationships, your role in the community, and your relationship within your role toward God, if you'd like to experience victory over greed in your life and make sure that it does not mar your legacy, like what is next for us is that we have to learn how to be rich towards God. We've got to take a next step in being rich towards God. So as we think about being rich towards God, I want to finish my time with you by talking about 3 faith decisions that need to be made, and then three action steps that you would take based on those faith decisions. So 3 faith decisions. So these 3 faith decisions, I'll tell you, they come from what Jesus says next after he tells this story in Luke chapter 12. And I'm going to let you read that for yourself at home. But these 3 come out of there. So the first faith decision is that God is a loving provider. That God is your loving provider. So if you're stuck in the mine loop, I am my provider, and so what I have is mine, you're going to experience the fruit of greed in your life. But if you could grab on to this idea that God is your loving provider. To some extent, we're all farmers. We work, but we have a skill set and we have knowledge, and there's so many things that God has given to us, and there's so much out of our control. That God is a loving provider. And he has provided everything for us in Jesus. If we start there, he came to us in Jesus and provides us with the forgiveness that we need in order to be in relationship with God. He has met our deepest needs, our need for life and for hope and for joy and for peace. He's provided all of that for us in Jesus. And if he's provided all of that for us in Jesus, he also provides everything else for us. And so there's this faith decision of God is my loving provider. He takes care of me. And maybe the first faith decision that you need to make is that I'm going to be trusting God as the one who's provided for my forgiveness, for my life, my eternal life, my relationship with him through Jesus. Maybe that's the first faith decision you make. But we've all got to make the faith decision that God is a loving provider. I don't provide for myself. It's not mine. God provides for me. And so I get to live under his provision. That's the first faith decision. The second one, there's more to life than just more for me and more for mine. And in theory, we all agree with this. I've asked this question to a bunch of different people in a bunch of different ways. Nobody ever argues. No. The whole point of life is how much can I get for myself, and how can I hoard it and hang on to it and just make sure that it doesn't help anybody? Nobody ever says that. In theory, we all agree with this, but if we really start looking at the way we live, we have to ask the question, do we live this out, right? Do we believe this, like we know this in our head, but do we believe this in our heart, that there's way more to life than just more for me, for mine? And maybe as you look at how you live, maybe you need to be asking God to help this move, this, like, yeah, I agree with that in my head. So, like, I'm really owning this in my heart. And then the third faith decision is this life is short, the next life is long. This life is just a few days. and it's the next one that lasts for eternity. So everything that's part of this life is for just a few days, and it impacts what's next. And so to embrace this life is short, and the next life is long, and then I'm free. I'm free to live in particular ways. And so as we make these faith decisions, then we're in relationship with God, and we're experiencing his provision in our lives, and we get to be practical, we get to live this out. And so 3 faith practices for people like us. The first one is to say thank you to God for what you do have. To be thankful to God for what you do have, to say thank you to him for what you do have. It's human, and we're all really good at seeing what we're missing in our lives, what we don't have. And it's easy to live with one or both eyes on what it is we're missing in our lives. And people who are on their guard against greed, recognizing that God is their provider, are paying attention to what they do have and are looking at what God has provided and being grateful for what we do have. And so to say thank you to God for what you do have. And then the second practice that flows out of this is to be sacrificial with your giving. To be sacrificial with your giving. All throughout the Bible, greatest antidote for greed is to give. Because we're all people in some way who have more than enough and enough, and there are people around us who have not enough, and so we all have opportunity to give. And as we think about giving, some of us don't give at all, and some of us are sporadic in our giving, and some of us give because we're supposed to, and then some of us give as an act of worship. And when you pull all that together, sacrificial giving, like where it costs you something. This feels counterintuitive. If you don't participate in this feels counterintuitive. Wait a minute, you're telling me the antidote to greed in my life is actually to give away so that I have less? That feels like that would make me want to have more. It doesn't work that way. It works exactly the opposite. When you give sacrificially, not just sporadically and not because like for this one month, if your giving doesn't cost you, you're missing an opportunity to battle, push back against greed in your life. You're missing an opportunity. And so we get to be people who say thank you to God for what we do have, and we get to get sacrificial with our giving. And that could be giving here at the church. That could be giving to a ministry partner that we have that you love and have a heart for, somebody who's a missionary. Like you get to choose what giving looks like in your life. But if it's not sacrificial, you're missing out on what God wants to give you in that. And so to be grateful to God for what you do have, to be sacrificial in your giving, and then to be grateful for what your giving supports. The other thing that's really human is as soon as you start to give to someone or something, it's really easy to be critical about what's happening there, because now you're invested. And for sure, the organization or the person that you're invested in, they're not doing it the way that you would do it. And they're spending money a way that you wouldn't spend money, or they're spending time the way you wouldn't spend time. And that drift, like if that drift that leads you wide open, like that's just a road that leads back to greed. And so to be incredibly grateful to God for what your giving supports. So to say thank you to God for what you do have, to get sacrificial with your giving, and then be really grateful to God for what your giving supports. Now you notice I've given you 3 practices here, but there's really 2 words: gratitude and giving. Gratitude and giving. If you're gonna be on guard against all kinds of greed in your life, it expresses itself through gratitude and through giving. And if we let greed invade, if we let it remain, if we let it take more ground, if we allow greed to stay in our life, what we experience is broken relationships, a a marred legacy, a bad perspective about who I am in my relationship with God and with other people, and eventually a day of difficult conversation with God for how we lived under the blessing that he has poured out to us. And so what Jesus wants for us, isn't this great that he tells us this story to be on guard against all kinds of greed so you don't live with messed up relationships and a bad perspective and a marred legacy. Like, we get to be people who are grateful and generous so that we who have more than enough get to be part of God's blessing in the lives of people who have less than enough. We get to continue to live under his blessing and under his pleasure in our lives, and that's what we want to experience. So I want to wrap all this up. Can I wrap this up by praying for us? Would you please bow your head and close your eyes with me, and then after I pray, I'll turn this service over to Whitney. So Father, thank you so much for warnings. Thank you for abundant blessing in our lives. Thank you for the opportunity that we have to grow in our gratitude and grow in our giving so that we can experience your continued and increased blessing in our lives, your hand of favor on us, and so that we can be part of what you're doing in the lives of other people. So we're here in great dependence on you. We need you to step into our lives. We need you to help us take these things that we know in our head, move them into our hearts so they become part of who we are and how we live. And we're expressing our hope and our confidence in you. So thank you, Jesus, for being our provision and being our provider. We love you and we pray these things in your name. Amen.